Let me introduce our panelists for today. So we have Rudina Seseri, Rob May, and Brian Eberman. And they will be talking about the impact of AI and data on today's enterprise.
Well, thank you. We're approaching the end of the day, so we're going to try to keep this as lively and as interactive as possible. And this is not a session about new models or machine learning. This is quite around the actual adoption on the enterprise and the business side of AI. And I hope we'll cover the challenges and opportunities and what we're seeing around the adoption and adoption cycle. So perhaps we'll start a bit with background. I'm a venture capitalist and run an early stage fund, 112 million, focused on AI and applied AI specifically for the enterprise, cybersecurity, and platforms. Rob?
So I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Tala. And then I also write a newsletter. Hopefully some of you read it. It's Inside AI. So if you go to inside.com/AI, I have about 30,000 subscribers, and we write daily AI news, and then I write commentary every weekend, so you should check that out. And I guess I'm on the panel to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we see in enterprise adoption. We have a sort of a new kind of knowledge base that's filled with automations, makes it easy to build chatbots off of for sales and support teams. And what we do is we try to take a bunch of unstructured natural language data, and as you're entering it into the knowledge base, we try to do a bunch of UI, UX tricks to actually structure it so we can build better models. And so we have a lot of experience selling into big companies. So I have a lot of stories to share there.
And I'm Brian Eberman. I'm an entrepreneur and technical leader. Most recently was with Jibo, the social robot company, but I've also worked in speech recognition and natural language processing for quite a few years. So I've seen a lot of problems in conversational AI, vision, and application to robotics over the years.
Perfect. Can you guys hear me on this one? Okay, we'll do the passing. So perhaps we'll start with a high-level question around what is your view around AI adoption in the enterprise, both from the what in the world does AI mean to enterprises and business folks, but also in a cycle of very early or we're seeing budget or it's a must-have. Where do you think we are?
I can tell you what we've seen in our sales pipeline is that there's still, I would say most companies are still in the tire kicker phase. So I don't know if any of you build AI products, but you get a lot of phone calls from people that when you say, hey, what made you reach out? They say, we want AI. Our boss said we need AI. And you're like, great, what do you want to do with the AI? And they're like, we don't know. Tell us what your AI does, and we'll see if that's something that we want to do. And so those are painful. We're seeing fewer of those. I would say we've been around about 2.5 years. And I would say in the last year, for the first time, we've started to see people come in with budgets and specifically defined projects to do stuff. But I would say that's still a very, very small group of forward-thinking companies. And a lot of the budgets are for partial rollouts and pilots and things like that. So what we're seeing mostly is, big companies. We just did a deal last week with the Fortune 500 company, has 30,000 people, and they're doing a 1-year test with 2,000 people for rolling out Tala. And so, so that's sort of where, from our point of view, what we see.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people hear the buzzword and they want to know, they want AI, but they don't know what it means, right? And how is it different from all the stuff I've been doing with machine intelligence or prediction or regression and stuff? The thing we were seeing a lot of was interest in finding ways to take their investments that they'd put into chatbots and various kinds of interfaces for users and find different ways of bringing that out to the market to get some more value, because ultimately enterprises want solutions that will produce more revenue for them.
And I'll add to that. One thing I tell people a lot of times, because I get this question a lot from sort of CIO types or CEOs who are like, hey, we want to do AI. Where should we start? So if I was in a big organization and I wanted to know where to start, I would do a couple of things, right? I'd say AI is primarily useful in the simplest format to predict things, automate things, and classify things. So I actually have this post you can go find online called the PAC framework, PAC, where I wrote about this on in the blog post. And what I would do is I would look at like your customers, your sort of operations, and a couple different buckets. And I would go through and I would look at like, where do I have data sets that might help me predict, automate, or classify, and like make that matrix across different pieces of your business, and then sort of overlay that with which ones would be most valuable, because you might have the data to predict something and you could go do it and it would be like marginally valuable to your business. You really have to start, we were having this discussion earlier, you have to start with things that are going to be the most transformative, because it's the only way you're going to get any traction. And a lot of these things are going to take big initiatives in your organization to change workflow behavior and stuff like that. So you got to start with the stuff that's going to have a big impact.
So to that very point, let's sort of elaborate on that. So if I'm a big enterprise and I know data is valuable, and even if I did and everybody else is saying so, do you think the better approach is I have data, I don't quite know what to do with it, but I know I need to hire data scientists, so let me go and start building that capability, then the rest will follow? Or is it, I have XYZ need, and I am going to go to the best and cutting edge vendors for such needs. I will not be a quote unquote AI native shop, but when I look for those vendors, AI is a must have, or a third option.
I'll take it first. So I think, as Rob was saying, the first thing is that an AI project or a data science project, right, is a very expensive project. And I think a lot of people underestimate how difficult it is from a data warehousing and data management. So I would start from where can I most transform my business if, right, any of those things he talked about. Could I change my logistics process? Could I change my ordering process? Could I change my inventory management process or my hiring process? What's the biggest lever for changing my business? But I'm going to have to transform the underlying processes in my business with AI, right? So you need to start with that, because it's going to be a significant investment. So then I think the answer to Rudina's question really boils down to, is that process core? Is the automation of that process core to your business value, or is the process the core to your business value? Right. So if you're Netflix and the recommendation engine is central to getting people to watch more stuff, then you better be the AI company that's delivering that capability. Right. But if you're a healthcare company and what you're trying to do is figure out better matches of doctors to patients or treatments to patients to save money, maybe you don't care as much about the AI. Right. What you care about is the relationship between your patients and your doctors.
Yeah, I think I think it's really tricky. Part of your question, if you have a specific need and you're looking for software to solve it, and then you go in and you say, should I use AI software? You really have to be careful and do your diligence, because on the one hand, I think you do want to be forward thinking and you don't want to deploy something that in 2 years you're going to have to rip out and replace with an AI solution. But a lot of AI solutions are not going to be best of breed for solving a lot of problems right now, either because you're not going to have the data, or because given the use case, like it might have a probabilistic output, and the users of the software don't understand that, and they're not going to understand how to interpret it. There's a whole bunch of problems there, so you got to be pretty thoughtful.
But to that end, just to be provocative, there is this, will I be left behind? Because some of the more innovative firms and companies, depending on whatever need they're solving, might be taking some more risk, but then they're native from the get-go. They're getting their data orchestration, harmonization, and getting value. Or you might have competitors that pop up in industries that traditionally are hard to disrupt because they have a data advantage. So how should an enterprise think about their data advantage or disadvantage? And similarly, how should they think about their talent bid, especially when machine learning trained talent, if you will, and data scientists wasn't a thing? I mean, you're hard-pressed to find people who have studied it that are older than 40. So a lot of universities are putting quite a bit of effort behind it, but let's call it for what it is. There's a scarcity of resource, which makes them very expensive. So how do we think about the data and talent dichotomy?
So so that's difficult. I can tell you, I think a lot about. I think at a high level, I think you have to be investing in AI somewhere in your business, because there's a lot to learn about how it works. We at Tala, we do this AI at Work podcast that you can find on iTunes, where we interview people about this kind of stuff. And we interviewed Steve Peltzman, who's the CIO at Forrester, and he talked about the fact that they've done a bunch of small projects that haven't turned out the way that they thought in AI. And so even though you could argue like they've had 3 or 4 failures in the AI space, they've learned a lot, and they have a really good framework now for thinking about how to apply AI at Forrester. So I think you got to think about that. And I'm not sure there are good answers yet to sort of absolute answers about AI the way you might have about other parts of your business, because so much of it's so new. But I do think there's a big potential that if you don't get going, the interaction between workflows and data and labeled data and how it drives your product and what it can do in your business, if you don't get those things going, it's not like when when Excel 2007 came out and you were like, it's buggy, I'm going to stay on Excel 2003 for 2 more years, and then when you finally deploy Excel 2007, you're on par with everybody else. There wasn't a big advantage that you'd been using it for a couple extra years. I'm not sure AI will be the same. There could be some risk there that you get left behind because of the newness of it and because of the way these models and these data sets can build on each other. And I have this whole theory that you're going to start to see more hierarchical types of models over the time that are doing more types of sort of cool things across data set. And if you're still working on your sort of one layer data set about water bottles or whatever, you're not going to be able to do the more complex stuff.
So years ago, I used to work with a large education company, and maintaining the first lesson that they had to be taught was don't throw anything away. Never ever throw data away. Exactly, but you have to be data hoarders. Even if you don't know how to manage it, even if you don't know what you're going to do with it, you got to start thinking in data-centric fashion. And then within a few years, they realized that what they most needed to figure out was the lifetime value and length of time someone would work with them and how far they get along in their education. And they had the data, right? And the other thing you can think about in AI is you don't necessarily have to do reinforcement learning, which is probably the most complicated thing we've talked about in the last couple of days. You can start with just, okay, given my data, I'm going to do some data analytics. I'm going to see about a linear regression, a multivariate regression of more and more complicated systems before you get to even a neural network will do for you. And a lot of companies are still at the, okay, I'm throwing away data stage. So get past that and get to the, all right, I'm going to start making some predictions on these core values that really matter to my business from the data.
So within my fund, as part of our investment thesis, we have a view which is we are moving from a world where data is informing decisions, almost that paradigm of data analytics, to a world where data is actually core and driving decisions. So if you will, the overused term predictions on the way to being prescriptive. As you think about data playing that role, what should large enterprises do to better align with that piece? And also, if you're looking for network effects, will the network effects come from the data or will it come from the algorithms? Especially considering that both sides of that pie coming together, you find open source options. So what is akin to what patents used to be as a barrier to entry?
I mean, my view is, in the many years I've been in this space, both in speech recognition and education and advertising, it's always about data. The real value is always in the data. And I think where you see the data-centric view is it analytics that I get a report, I study the report, I try and make some business decisions, and that cycle is like a couple of weeks to months to quarters, right, depending on the scale? Or is it a real-time integrated solution that's making a decision constantly for me, right? So when I was lurking in the lead generation space, you had to have a real-time computation on everything to figure out the value. And that's where AI becomes really valuable, because it's saying, okay, this is worth 5% more at that moment. And you could make a different decision, and that's something a person could never do.
I think for some use cases, you're definitely going to see data-driven network effects. So the idea that if I have 1,000 pieces of data and I add piece number 1,001, all the first 1,000 get a little more valuable, depending on what I'm trying to predict, up to some level of scale. So I do think you'll see some of that. But I also think the thing that you want to think about is when you look at trends in enterprise UX UI design, you had on-premise software, then it was all about like cloud, make it easy to deploy, make it run in a browser. Then it was all about make it mobile, make it look like our consumer app, so you can tag it and put up avatars and have a feed. And I think the next wave in enterprise UX UI design is going to be about how do you capture lots of little signals as part of your UX UI that help you train better machine learning models. How, like, we think about Tala Like, what's so different than using like the Tala knowledge base versus say like Confluence is every little thing that you do is designed to give feedback to a model. And so when you're doing something that and we try to build it as natively as we can in workflows, and that makes the whole tool smarter. And so I think that's going to be, I think the companies that can figure that out, if you believe sort of in the last wave design was an advantage, I think this kind of design could be an advantage for a lot of companies going forward.
So the other big theme around enterprises obviously is automation. So one question is AI truly ready for applied AI or narrow AI, the phase we're in, truly ready for prime time automation, or is it the human in the loop really the pervasive form or augmentation on the way to automation? And how should buyers of your products, but also people who are building their own teams think about that facet of AI?
Automation's tough because it's unless you come from like a robotic process automation background, people don't think about it the right way. So I'll give you an example. We tend to look at SaaS apps as investors or CEOs or whatever and kind of say, what's the usage like, right? Well, if you're automating something, you might have less usage over time, particularly if you have a human in the loop. The whole point should be we're removing this from you so you don't have to do it anymore. So if you're successful, maybe your product usage goes down. At least your interactions, as defined by your interactions with the humans, goes down. Which is a little bit counterintuitive. And so if you're a company and you're trying to think about how do I know this deployment is successful, you have to shift the way that you think about some of these things. So yeah, I think I think there's a lot of problems there.
Well, I mean, I think it really depends on the task. So like I said about real-time stuff, so when I was running an advertising company, we had to make time decisions in real time, right? So the AI we built there was designed to make that. But when I was doing speech recognition, and a lot of you have probably picked up the phone and heard those How May I Help You apps that Nuance built that I was working on. We always did human in the loop, right? So it was always a human support system that would help fall back. And you can use that to train the AI, right? So there's a lot of tasks, I think in Tala, is kind of you're using the feedback from humans to tell you what's the right answer, right? So there are a lot of tasks that are sort of unstructured where it's more of a decision support, and it can just get better and better over time. And I would look at a lot of those applications.
So shifting gears a little bit around, if we were to use your experiences as proxies of both, what does it take for an AI startup to actually get off the ground, or for folks who are actually trying to build data science team or build their own AI capabilities? You're both repeat entrepreneurs and both deeply steeped in the space. What is different about building an AI company versus a traditional software or hardware, for that matter, company? I have my own views, but I'll let you go first.
Zeta Venture Partners has a really good post about minimum viable models, I think they called it, that you can go find. And I think that's what you have to think about is like, what is the smallest thing you can do to prove that your AI works at some kind of scale so that you can start to get some believers. Because the biggest thing that happens is like there's kind of so much bullshit in the AI space that buyers are very, very skeptical. And you want to be able to show, no, this can move the needle, this has an impact, this is different. And you want to get there as fast as possible, I think. And as we think a lot about minimum viable product coming from the SaaS world, I think we've honed very much in on how to get something built that people can use, but it doesn't really stop there with AI. It's really about how do you get something built that if you're trying to predict or you're trying to automate, they can do the minimum level of that to be valuable. So that's where I would start.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on that SaaS thread, in a SaaS thread, you'd discuss with an enterprise exactly what it was supposed to do. You'd go and build that SaaS capability. You'd run all the tests, and it would just work. Right? If as long as you wrote good software, it would meet the requirements that were promised in the RFP or in the spec. The problem with AI is you build that, you say this is what it's going to do. You have a tiny amount of data because that's all you've gotten. You deploy it, and it does not work, right? Because you don't have enough data. It works like this far compared to where it's eventually going to work. So that's a much harder buying decision for enterprises, I think, to get their head around. And the other thing I've seen is the data-centric focus is really important. You have to design your organization to think about data and data-based decisions from the get-go, right? Because that's not how they're used to thinking. They're used to thinking about having organizational meetings and conversations and the traditional process.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, like I'm an angel investor in 52 companies. I think 46 are AI companies, and they're slow compared to just across the board what I've seen compared to non-AI companies in terms of rollouts, building their all their processes. So.
And I'll opine on this one. I think be prepared that the equivalent of what would be your setup effort before you go into a repeatable SaaS model, your setup effort is way higher. Your initial costs are way higher than a normal typical software company, and the time to market is higher. So whether you're budgeting for it within a large enterprise or if you're a startup, you're going to get caught in no man's land funding-wise way sooner than you ever thought. And it's less about excellence of execution, it's much, or lack thereof, is much more about what it takes to get the data sets, what it takes to hone in on whatever part of your algorithms is the open source versus what you're building in-house, talent and otherwise. So while the medium and long-term advantages, while at scale of outperforming the other solutions are absolutely there and they're real barriers to entry, the initial effort I think is higher, which also means finding talent is also harder for the reasons that we discussed. And I think lastly, go in with another way that you can solve the problem up front to Rob's point rather than I'm AI, because you'll get the meeting, you won't get the dollars. I want to ask if the audience, we have another set of questions I can continue, but any questions from the audience? Yeah, please, Floyd, introduce yourself.
Yes, hi there. I'm Floyd Smith from MemSQL, which is a startup company in the database space. And you've just made me glad we're not in the AI space. It's made it sound tough. This sounds like a tough use case for AI. Think of a classic SaaS or SaaS type startup selling to enterprise. Small number of customers, small number of transactions. You're trying to get to a transaction size of around 100K or so in the early days, right? So it doesn't seem like there's a ton of data there to use AI to crunch through. So does it make sense to invest much in using AI as part of doing sales and marketing for a company like that?
You mean, and so like I have, this product, this widget over here, but I'm using my AI to do sales and marketing of my product? Yeah, I think it's hard, right? Because I think when you're building a product, when you're building a company from the ground up, one of the things that people forget is there are a lot of things that are great products and they're not great businesses. And so sometimes you find yourself in this space where you've got a good product and you can't reach the buyer cost effectively, or you can't get the price point that makes it worth your while or whatever. And so what you really have to do is you have to go after a couple of target profile customers and bring those in. And it requires a lot of, I think, manually looking at the data right now. AI is not smart enough yet to optimize that for us. So you have to manually look at your early sales data, your marketing data. Where do people come in? You have to form hypotheses, test on that off small data sets. Although, look, maybe somebody will build a tool. There are these, with transfer learning and probabilistic programming, like there are these small data AI waves coming. And then sort of from there, form your hypotheses and try to start to go. But it takes a while because sometimes you even think you found the right sales and marketing, like the right customer profile, but then you find out like they're churning out the back end of your product 6 months later or a year later if you're an enterprise company, and you got to go back and start over and actually sell to somebody else. So I think that's hard.
Yeah, no, I don't really have much to add. I mean, the transfer learning I think will have to be done by Salesforce, right? They'll have to come in and say, companies that look like you, here, give us some additional data, because they have a giant pool of data on what closes. If they can find a way to model it, they'll find a way to then sell you a product saying, model your customers into these things and we'll tell you who's going to close.
So it's fascinating because if you are in my seat, the highest deal volume I am seeing on AI companies is actually players trying to intelligently disrupt Salesforce and be AI native on the CRM side and other areas. So it depends on where you sit. I do think that marketing and sales as a category is actually one of the early, if you want to look at it departmentally, and HR for that matter too, but one of the early areas for AI, for augmentation or human in the loop type solutions, because it actually tends to be data intensive. You have to develop a funnel, a pipeline of sales, so way bigger than what you actually close. How can you do that intelligently? There are tons and tons of solutions that are leveraging some level of machine learning and predictives around that capability, all the way to automating your creative. And programmatic is a very sort of pervasive form. What programmatic advertising and marketing, it's all data, programmatic fill-in for data. So it lends itself naturally. I do think that it's better for companies that are consumer facing because there is more data. But like there are companies in what's called CDP, customer data platform, where they're quite successful leveraging AI on a B2B type environment.
I'm going to fool around with it for choosing blog post topics and things like that.
Yeah, that could be cool.
Any other? Yeah, please.
How do you tackle the cultural challenges around data silos and departments not wanting to share their data with each other? Do you guys have a strategy around how we can tackle those kinds of challenges in the enterprise?
I would just say, I think it's one of the reasons what you're seeing people do in response is add these chief AI officers, and there's a little bit of a like, you don't need one, no, you need one sort of debate going on. But that, that might be one solution is just having a person whose job it is to sort of straddle that no matter what.
No, the only thing I would say is the more frequent problem, and again, that has to be a big company issue, which is basically silos, more pervasive than just around data. I think on AI native companies, the new challenge that I've not seen before that I do see is who's driving product. Is it the product team, is it the tech team, or is it the data team? And so you used to have the business founders and the technical founders. Now they have this data machine learning group. How do they fit in this dichotomy? And then also researchers often don't do. While you're striving for a minimum viable product in no time, researchers tend to be perfectionists, so that cultural shift manifests itself. They want 3 years.
Kind of that, yeah. The other thing you have from a data perspective when you're building new products in the AI space is like engineering is relatively well understood, computer engineering at this point. And so if you go to your team and you're like, hey, this thing supports 10,000 people per month, and we need it to go to 1 million per month over the next year, they kind of know roughly what they probably have to do unless they hit a weird bug or a weird unexpected snag. They can probably tell you roughly how long it's going to take. When you go to your data science team and you're like, this model is 72% accurate. We think to really make the customers like it, it needs to be 88% accurate. They're like, okay, how long do you want us to work on this? Well, how long do you think it'll take? We don't know. We can try some stuff. How long do you want us to try some stuff? Like it's much more researchy in trying to do, and like working that into your product management process when you haven't done it before is difficult.
Yeah, we'll comment on that. That's a great point. I mean, I think product managers have a very hard time understanding that. So that kind of aspect ends up working through the CTO kind of pathway, which was my experience at the robot company. Like in face recognition, like I got exactly that answer. And the only thing you can really do is try and create a thread of progress. You're like, okay, we're going to set up a monthly progress map, and I'm going to look at the velocity that I'm achieving, and I know that there's a S-curve to this, and so I can sort of plot that and make an estimate of when I'm going to land at the top of that S-curve, right? And that's tough for product managers to deal with.
Go ahead.
In this conference, I hear a lot of cloud service providers are saying, we have the framework, we have a lot of models, and then data scientists come use our stuff, because we have a lot of resources and tools for you to build your AI applications. But then offline, I talked to a lot of enterprises. One of them is pharma. They were saying, oh, no, I can't put my data in the cloud. I have to build my own AI infrastructure, and I have existing HPC environment. I can kind of leverage that and build my own expertise. So what's your take on, how enterprise should adopt AI? Should they leverage public clouds, or should they build their own, AI environment in-house?
Well, I'll make one comment. I mean, I think that's a very difficult question for two industries in particular, banking and health. And with GDPR, it's gotten even more difficult because I think it's hard to know whether the big cloud providers are actually going to delete your data when you're asked to delete it, even though they might say they're going to. So I don't know that's not an easy answer because a lot of those frameworks will fortunately run on your own cloud if you bring it up, right? But it'll be much harder to set up. It's going to be a much larger expense, and so it's going to scale it up even further. Now, Amazon, I believe, has a HIPAA compliant environment, so you could explore that if you're on the healthcare space. But it is a tough question.
I have exposure to one of the top 3 pharma companies, and what I will say is my learning, so this is outside of my day-to-day, but I know, think about that. They are in the cloud. I think the challenge is more which one of the clouds do you use, because if you have the slightest suspicion that Amazon is coming after you in the pharma space, and they are, you're taking down your enterprise off of Amazon and coming up with an alternative cloud. So it's more the Amazon risk rather the private or on-prem versus cloud. Yes, go ahead in the back.
I know you mentioned earlier about the speed of development in AI. And do you think that the agile methodology and tools such as CA, Computer Associates Rally, could that fit into that development life cycle, or are there challenges with that? And would it be successful? Would you be have faster versioning, faster output?
I can tell you, you definitely can run it that way. We do a lot of Agile as well. It takes some shifting, to our point earlier when we were talking about the data science teams, to sort of get data science worked into that, which is more researchy and doesn't always have, it's kind of less milestone driven sometimes and more activity driven. Like, we're going to do these things, and we don't know if we're going to be here or here at the end of this. It's pretty easy for an engineer to estimate what they're going to build in a sprint in Python because that's all well understood. But I do think it'll get better. Like, you're just now starting to see people talk more publicly about how AI impacts product management and some of this stuff. And I think people come up with lots of cool methodologies and ideas and different strategies for making some of that work.
Yeah, I completely agree with Rob. You just have to adapt the data science piece to more of an activity base, and you're not going to know what the outcome is. So, for example, a data scientist might say, I will have downloaded TensorFlow and run it on my data. That's my activity for the week, right? Or I will have collected and processed 100,000 particular elements of data and tell you where we are, right? And so what you have to do if you want to, as a manager, know where am I making progress? So you're on AI or any kind of data analytics, you're always looking at the metric. There's some metric that you better have defined, right? Some accuracy or performance metric. So what we were doing was, all right, every week or every month, whatever the right time period is based on the activity rate at which your team can run, plot the metric, right? And how is that curve going straight? Is it starting to go like this, or is it going like that? And then you can start estimating whether or not you should stop investing or whether you should put more into it, and when you're actually going to achieve the goal, or if you're going to achieve the goal that you set for yourself, because you may not.
The other story I'll tell and add to that, for those of you who are not technical, so after I sold my last company, I was like, all right, I'm going to do an AI company next. I'm going to hire a data science coach to teach me about it, not because I want to write the code for the company, but because I want to learn a little bit about this. And so week after week, we work through this, and we get to the end of the project, and I turn to the guy, and I'm like, so 85% of data science is basically how do you get the data, and how do you clean it and put it in a format that you can use? Because literally every week was the thing doesn't work now because even though I thought it had commas, it's got these random commas here and these spaces here, and this one piece in this whole list is not formatted the right way, and it's messing everything up. And we spent a lot of time just working with this stuff to get in a format. So it feels slow compared to I have a Ruby on Rails framework. Let me quickly pop up something, and now I've got a little prototype app to show you. It's almost like on the other side. It's very frustrating.
Right. And just to follow on that, and that depends a lot on that's why data first. If you're going to start a new organization, you're starting a new company, you got to think about the data and the organization of the data up front, because then you don't pay that penalty as much.
So let me ask, keep the mic. So let me ask, I'm going to speak loudly. Let me ask you a follow-up question. Is it, if you are a large incumbent in a space, does your incumbency give you an advantage and you can retrofit AI? Or do you have a better shot of being a player without the incumbency, but being AI native?
I think, yeah. So the question was: are you better off being the incumbent with a giant pile of data that's in warehouses and hasn't been thought out how you're going to do AI on it, or are you better off being a new player who can think through the data and how you're going to do the AI up front? I mean, I think that depends a lot on the market power of the player, right? So if I was going to become a healthcare company, I think it'd be really hard to start a brand new healthcare company focusing on data, right? Because it's just hard to be an insurance company.
And how is the adoption of AI looking like in healthcare right about
Exactly.
now?
But on the other hand, if I'm a big blue, I have a giant pile of data, but it's pretty much unformatted and unstructured because I have all these notes from all these doctors that it's written in completely different ways. Huge NLP task, right? That would have been easier if it had been structured up front.
I'm going to ask a couple of forward-looking questions, but any other questions before I do that? No? Oh, yes, please. I want to give the mic to myself.
Thanks. Yeah, just taking a little bit the conversation a little different direction. You mentioned GDPR and thinking about China becoming like a huge powerhouse on AI. The amount of data that we have to be able to process. I mean, in the past, there has been companies that have not been allowed to do business in the US because of that amount of data sharing. What is your take right now on that policy, like the regulation of AI and an American company, for example, using a Chinese service for AI?
I'm happy to answer that.
Why don't you start? Because you're huffing and puffing.
So, does everybody know what GDPR is? Raise your hand if you don't know what GDPR. I'll give you a quick overview of that. So, the European Union passed a General Data Privacy Restriction Act, which had to go into effect by the end of May. So, if you've all seen on your web browser when it comes in and says, "We use cookies, right, to track your behavior," that's a response to GDPR, and it's some lawyers have said, well, that's sufficient. I think there are a bunch of other lawyers say that's not going to be good enough. So, I mean, I think there are huge, besides the privacy issues working with Chinese companies, there are huge technical issues that I've run into that I'd be happy to go into, but I'd be very concerned about that. I think, even a US company has to obey GDPR if you're interacting with any European customer. So you have 100,000 customers in the US and 5 in Europe, you're still subject to GDPR. And if you're running them in China, right, I don't know how you could do that. So I think China actually has a huge advantage on AI right now. I think Kai-Fu was right on target when he talked about it this morning, if you didn't see his talk. They're much more lax about a lot of different things around privacy. They're supporting AI much more aggressively. I think we're really going to have two legs that are going to become disparate if we're not careful.
I don't know what'll happen with all that, but I can tell you what I hope will happen. You see a lot of tech waves, if you look historically back to like the 50s or 60s, go through centralization, decentralization, centralization, decentralization, right? And you had the web, and then you had AOL, and a lot of people thought AOL was the web, and then then there were people went to blogs, and there were aggregators, and then that happens a lot. And I think the stuff you're talking about may drive a trend away from these like monstrous, homogenous companies that own everything, and might open up opportunities for more oligopoly like market structures where you have people that cater to different verticals and use cases and all that, and you have a little more diversity in there. So
I worry about China. I think we're investing with private mechanisms. I don't think there's any concerted government effort both on the regulation side around data in the US. Europe is ahead of us in terms of consumer protection. But I think the amount that the Chinese government is investing vis-a-vis the US is several-fold higher. So I think that purely, and then when you don't have concerns around privacy and democracy, you're just using the data. From a model training point of view, you have an advantage. So I think I am concerned on that front. I do believe in capitalism, and we've seen a lot of their lead scientists coming on this side and working for the big tech companies. So from that perspective, they have a brain drainage problem, but it's something to keep an eye on. My wrap-up question, because I think we're tight on time, is actually what you just started to hint at, which is what paradigm will we see emerging in the next 2 to 5 years? Is it the Facebooks and the Salesforces of the world and Google and whatnot will be the data hoarders, to go with your description and my choice of vocabulary? Or will we see a world of connectivity that continues to generate new and different kinds of amount of data that is even larger, so today's incumbents will not persist in the same form? What's your view?
So one of the things you have to remember is there are a lot of opportunities. This latest wave has been driven by like deep neural networks primarily. There are a lot of other types of AI, right? There's symbolic logic and that old stuff, and there's people like Doug Hofstadter who believe in analogy making. There's like Jeff Hawkins and like hierarchical temporal memories, and there's a whole bunch of different approaches. And I think what's interesting is we haven't had a lot of success with the small data approaches yet, but it's partially because the companies that are driving a lot of the AI research, Google, Facebook, like they don't have any incentive to do small data stuff because data is their strategic weapon and their asset. So I think it's an open question whether small data solutions can come along in, not next year, but 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, and take on some of them. I don't know. I definitely hope so. But I think one of the things to think about, if you haven't read the book by Yuval Harari, Homo Deus, it's really, really fascinating. And one of the things he talks about, like with respect to China, is that part of the reason communism failed is because like central planning is very difficult because you don't have perfect information, so better to decentralize your thing, everything, and let the markets determine it. But if you could have a relatively intelligent system that could process all the data, like it might actually work again. And so I believe that there's a risk that some of these technologies and the things that they enable, sort of technology climbs this ladder and influences politics and economics and the thought and the interaction between them maybe at levels that it hasn't before, because it's going to create new opportunities and all kinds of crazy stuff. So read that book.
So I'll just close with picking up on one of the comments Rob made about the waves, right? If you remember, some of you might remember, time sharing, right? And then we had PCs and we had workstations and then it went back. So we have this back and forth between the edge and the centralized. And that's driven lots of things in changes in computing. And I think there was a very nice talk today, if you had a chance to go, on edge computing for AI. And he made a comment that was really telling, which is he was doing things with traffic lights on Raspberry Pis. He's like, I can do what costs $10,000 a month in Amazon costs for 2 Raspberry Pis if I do it on the edge. So, these are really unexploited. Right? And I think there's going to be a big wave of stuff that's going to come around edge computing for AI and tying together lots of phones or lots of devices. That'll be stateful, and because it's stateful, it'll be more efficient, and that's an interesting way to possibly break it out.
And by the way, that's one device. We're entering a world of everything connected. So as you add more sensors, more diversity and more data. Thank you. That's all we had.
Thank you.